ถัดไปเนี่ยจะเป็นเรื่องของการ creating great spaces for learning ค่ะโดยคุณแอนดรูว์แฮร์ริสันนะคะท่านเป็นกรรมการบริษัท Spaces That Work นะคะแล้วยังเป็นศาสตราจารย์ปฏิบัติวิชาชีพจากมหาวิทยาลัยแห่งเวลส์ Trinity St David ด้วยนอกจากนี้นะคะคุณแอนดรูว์ยังเป็นที่ปรึกษาแล้วก็ผู้เชี่ยวชาญทางด้านของสภาพแวดล้อมการเรียนรู้เป็นผู้เขียนหนังสือของท่านเนี่ยชื่อว่า Designing for the Changing Educational Landscape Space Place and the Future of Learning ขอเสียงปรบมือต้อนรับคุณแอนดรูว์แฮร์ริสันค่ะ Big round of applause for คุณแอนดรูว์ please
Thank you. Hello, I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to just share some thoughts about learning space and how learning spaces and libraries are coming together in very interesting ways. And I'm particularly proud and honoured to be here today at a function for TK Park because I have long used TK Park as an example worldwide for what an innovative learning space can look like. So I'm delighted to continue this conversation today. As I was introduced, I'm a consultant who spends their time looking at learning spaces. I'm a psychologist by background, not an architect. So what I'm interested in is how space can support people to do what they want to do. How can space support learning in all its different forms? Because space can equally get in the way, can constrain or can stop you doing what you want to do. So I help people to communicate what they need in their spaces and then work that through to design for architects to actually create those spaces. Yet again, trouble with the slides. Why I love working and learning at all levels. I work in schools, colleges, universities, and commercial learning environments, is that we are in such a period of great change. There is nothing fixed or decided about learning, and that we're really having to explore new ways of doing things that use space in very imaginative ways. We think about the impact of technology on learning process, the internet. When I was at university, I spent all my time going to libraries, looking at physical resources, whereas now we have the world's information at our fingertips. What does that mean for learning? What does that mean for teaching? We're seeing a shift towards more collaborative, active learning spaces or active learning processes within schools and colleges and universities, where learners are having to take more responsibility for their learning themselves and actually figure their way through information and resources and work together to solve problems. There's also more interest and more emphasis on interdisciplinary learning. We've spent hundreds of years building up these silos of knowledge, and now there's the realization that actually a lot of the interesting things that happen are in the spaces between the disciplines. So what happens when you bring computer science together with artists or engineers and biologists? What new ideas can come from that are different and can potentially be sort of solving major world problems? The other, I think, huge opportunity that libraries can embrace very much is the blurring of boundaries. Traditionally, learning was a period of one's life, and then one went out into work and continued to develop professionally. But actually now we're seeing continual reinvention of skills, of knowledge, and the blurring between learning, research, work, and leisure activities. So as we heard in the example earlier on, the library here, that is as much a leisure space and a social space as it is an academic space and a research space. We're also finding that increasingly institutions are working together. So how can you bring libraries together, bring learning spaces together to be shared by more than one institution? Or how can they be shared between commercial organizations and academic institutions? Again, from a point of economy, but also from a point of exposing more people to ideas and innovation. And within the UK particularly, universities are being challenged to be useful, which is a bit of a shock sometimes. But the notion that actually, what's the impact of the work that universities do. How can universities encourage innovation and entrepreneurship and invention by creating opportunities for people to come together and explore ideas and solve problems in new ways? So lots of pressures for change. There is nothing stable. And we need to look at how space can respond to these challenges in a whole range of different ways. What this effectively means is that we do have to come up with new space models for education. For every type of space is up for change, for challenge, for exploration. You'll be pleased to know that my talk today is 1 hour 15 minutes is the maximum. My record for this presentation is 7.5 hours for one presentation, as we went through each type of space as to how it was changing. So today you have a summary, which I'm sure you're very relieved about. I think the big summary headlines is that the traditional categories of space in many learning institutions are changing. Space is becoming less specialized and much more robust and agile to be able to change functions from one thing to another, either on a daily basis, a monthly basis, or over many years. Is that what's a laboratory now may not be a laboratory in 5 years' time or 3 years' time. So we need to create space that is able to respond to changing demands. It's also increasingly realized that we should design space around human interaction, around patterns of human need and interaction, rather than specific needs of a discipline or a department. It's incredibly hard to change a space that's designed for only one thing. So how do we create much more general spaces that are adaptable for different focuses? And let's think about the quality of life for everyone that engages with the learning space, the academics, the students, the visitors, the people passing through the space. That's leading to a very different blend of spaces within campus, where as much attention is being paid to the cafeteria and the student centre as is to the classrooms, because it's really thinking about every minute of the day that the staff or the student spends at the university is something we have to think about very carefully. And so the way of thinking about space, and this applies just as much to libraries as it does to other spaces on the campus, is to think about how spaces can support the pedagogies. And what are the different types of learning activities that you want to accommodate within the space, and create spaces that support those activities or multiple patterns of those activities. So what are the spaces that you support, that you create that support thinking? Spaces for concentration, for contemplation, for reflection. It's very easy to just rush towards a more exciting, buzzy, active learning space and forget about the fact that some people need quiet, need time to reflect. So let's think about that as an important space type. What are the spaces that support designing and collaboration and sort of brainstorming and making? Collaborating spaces, presenting spaces. Is this the ideal space, for example, for presenting to 400 people? Or is there another way that we could do it that would engage you in a different way? What are making spaces, practicing spaces? So this gets away from thinking about spaces being owned by an individual department or faculty, but to think about activity spaces that could be shared by more than one person. What we're having to accommodate, and this definitely applies across the whole learning spectrum, is increasingly diverse learning approaches. So as I've said already, a much stronger focus on collaborative, active learning. This is starting very much at early school days, but following right through to postgraduate study, where case-based learning or problem-based learning is increasingly becoming a core methodology. It's about creating spaces to support integrated multidisciplinary learning. Some universities build specific interdisciplinary buildings where you have to compete to get space in that building, where scientists can mix with engineers, with artists, with a whole range of people who have a particular problem focus that they're interested in. Very importantly, and a theme that I'll come back to throughout the presentation today, is we need to support distributed learning. Learning can take place anywhere, anytime. thanks to the technology and mobile devices. So how do we support people off campus as much as on campus? And how do we support the blurring of boundaries between those two? It's always very interesting in the UK, where I work quite often, is if you visit the coffee shops and the other spaces around the campus, that's often just as full of students working as it is on campus. So what's the virtual network, the digital space, that supports the people who are working in this much broader place? So just a couple of diagrams showing the sort of range of learning type spaces and settings that we need to think about. This diagram here looks at two particular axes that acknowledging the range of settings that vary between informal spaces, which could be created on a minute-by-minute basis by students or staff, up to much more formal structured spaces that are defined more closely, versus spaces that are about information versus ones that are about task. So this is just a sort of taxonomy of learning spaces. And they support different types of learning activities, high interaction learning spaces versus low interaction. As I said, there is still the need for some activities where it's me on the stage, you listening, versus much more active laboratory type spaces where people are working together to solve problems. And some spaces are occupied for long periods of time and others are much more intermittent. So again, it's about looking at the rhythm of the spaces that you're creating. In libraries, for example, I find it fascinating if you look at different times in the academic year, how those spaces are used very differently. At the beginning of the academic year, it could be traditional problem groups, individual study, but as you get closer to exams, the energy changes and it becomes much more a concentrated study space. So how do you create spaces that can actually change over time? So this is a sort of taxonomy of learning settings that I think any sort of learning environment needs to be able to provide, or at least to ask questions about what the needs are for each of these settings. So we really need to look at spaces that support the individual learner, right the way through to sort of small groups, medium groups, and large groups. And those large groups can go into hundreds and hundreds, which have very different requirements from a technology point of view, from an infrastructure point of view, and a sort of settings point of view. Some learning settings don't require any boundary. They can just flow from setting to setting in groups. And the library reading area or social space could be a good example of that. In other cases, degrees of separation, of boundary control, can actually help those spaces to perform better. So the notion of creating semi-enclosed spaces or with notice boards on them or whiteboards or technology screens starts to provide some fixes which people can work with to create a meaningful learning setting. And in some cases, like the karaoke rooms that I've heard about today, which is a first for me, I'm going to go back to the UK and recommend we put karaoke rooms in our academic libraries and see how well that goes down. But some spaces do need total enclosure so that people can collaborate, be noisy, can use sound, can use vision, video equipment. So that's perfectly fine. Technology landscape, also very important. I think we could all agree that there's a basic level now of technology infrastructure that we get panicky if we don't have access to wireless communications or mobile. But it's really expensive if you put everything everywhere. So let's think about the technology landscape as well. You have the pervasive base level of technology. Where do you enhance it to create nodes of excellence, of advanced technology? And where's the really heavy-duty stuff? If you have 90 people in a classroom all using video simultaneously on an iPad, which we've done in some pilot spaces, your network is very likely to fall over. It's too much capacity. So you have to design for the maximum level of bandwidth. So we sort of start to think about a technology topography of where are the hot spots likely to be, where are the medium spots, and where are the light areas. Also, the ability to reconfigure space at different timescales is really important. Some spaces we want to reconfigure on a minute-by-minute basis. Within a class, we want people to move the chairs around and move from being performance through to lecture, through to small group work. And that needs very resilient, very agile furniture that has wheels that can be moved. Other times you want to be able to reconfigure from a semester to semester basis or over a number of years. If you have a laboratory, it's very hard to reconfigure that on an easy basis, but you can put in an infrastructure that supports change over time. So don't put the infrastructure in the floor or whatever, you make it accessible so that things could change. So this is just a really useful taxonomy we use for helping institutions think about the blend of spaces and the characteristics of each of those spaces. Because effectively you could map each of the spaces in your library against this taxonomy to see what balance of spaces you're providing. Are you mainly supporting individuals? Or are you supporting small groups, medium groups? What are the opportunities for each of these elements within the space? So if you think about the broader learning landscape within an institution or even within a library, there are these three characters of space that need to be thought through. At the university level, we're seeing the amount of specialized space really compress because this is the expensive stuff. Laboratories, for example, are the most expensive space type on a university. But in the UK, where we've done studies measuring the use of laboratories, typically a laboratory is utilized only between 8 and 12% of the time. If you look at how those spaces are positioned, effectively they're very expensive spaces that are used when they're needed, but quite a lot of the time you may have 6 students in a laboratory for 20 people. That's a really expensive waste of space. So how do you compress those spaces down to the minimum that you need and then transfer some of those activities into more general space that's less expensive? Within a laboratory, for example, you may need a test bed and all the equipment for doing the experiment, but when you're writing up the experiment using just your PC, you don't need to spend that time in the laboratory. You could go to another place that's suited for writing rather than the laboratory. So how do you reduce the amount of specialized space and increase the amount of generic or flexible space? But where a lot of the really interesting things are happening in many of the countries that I work in is there's a realization that actually the formal spaces are important, the specialized classrooms, the timetabled spaces, but actually they're only about 20%, 20 to 25% of a typical campus is timetabled teaching space. What's happening in the rest of the space, which is just as expensive to construct? Well, a typical university, 30 to 35% of your space are the corridors, the spaces between the classrooms, the entry lobbies of the buildings, the sort of in-between spaces, we call them. On top of that, you have the libraries, you have cafeterias, you have all these other spaces which make up the bulk of the campus. So let's think about every square meter in the building to see how that contributes towards the learning, teaching, and research process. So I could give you a 40-minute talk on corridors because I think they're a huge opportunity. And some of the libraries I work with, we're trying to bust out of the library into all these other interstitial spaces around the university to make those information spaces in their own rights. So let's think about the learning landscape at each of these three categories, and I'll come back to that in some examples later on. The other thing I find very exciting is that it's not just about space, it's about time. That really when we're thinking about creating these new ways of learning or new learning spaces, we need to think about how technology, time, and space and pedagogy are all working together in an integrated way. We're seeing an increased use of blended learning, where it's not about delivering facts in a lecture or in a class. That could be done on podcasts, can be done using the virtual learning environments anywhere. So actually when people come together, you want a high-value learning experience. And that tends to be about discourse, about conversation, about exploring ideas. So you're starting to need to flip the learning process so that people learn by themselves the basic facts, the information, and then interpret and explore that information in a face-to-face class. So again, a very different type of space needed. It's not about communication or downloading of lots of information. It's about creating settings that encourage the sharing of ideas. It's also important that if you're starting to use time and space differently, maybe the timetable needs to change as well. There's absolutely no point in creating really dynamic, flexible spaces if you're then trying to cram their use into 50-minute periods where you have no time to do any of these innovative learning spaces. So we're seeing many institutions thinking about the learning day in a very different way. So space, time, curriculum, pedagogy, and all of these things need to be thought of in parallel to come up with a learning landscape that actually delivers what you need to deliver. What I'm going to do now is just talk about a few learning spaces which are not focused directly in libraries, but they're all spaces that I think are applicable to libraries in different ways. But I just wanted to start off with this slide, which I think is an absolutely beautiful learning space from 1945 by Saarinen. I think it's cut off where it's from. It's in Finland, or Scandinavia, definitely. What I found fascinating about this is 1945 classroom, but it has many of the characteristics of a modern learning studio in that it's a multi-activity space. It's an L-shaped space. There are zones of different learning activities. And it's like, how did we go away from that to cookie-cutter classrooms further on? We lost the innovation and the pedagogy that went with the space. And actually, in the UK's case, if you go back to the 1851 school pattern book, which is definitely worth a read. It's a very thick volume which tells you how to design a school in 1851. What they had as their core learning space were large, flexible spaces that could be divided with curtains into different learning zones, where older children would work with younger children to teach each other. And you think, wait a second, that's what I'm designing now, but for a completely different pedagogy. So that thinking around that relationship between space and pedagogy got lost somewhere, and now it's rethinking. So what I'm saying is, let's innovate, but let's not throw away the baby with the bathwater, as we say. Here's an interesting example of spaces where they've broken away from the mold. This is the telephone school in Scandinavia again, where there are no classrooms, where the whole school is a series of learning zones and home bases, and the children move between these zones and are taught to work in open spaces and explore ideas in groups. Works perfectly, as long as there is this relationship between pedagogy and space, that everyone knows how these spaces are supposed to be used. We've had some great disasters in the UK of learning spaces where the space changed and the pedagogy didn't. You cannot have 3 teachers all shouting at the same time in a big open space. It goes horribly wrong. And so they blame the space. It's not the space, it's the combination of the space and the pedagogy. So one of my big lessons is you cannot think about space in any form without thinking about the activities that you want to deliver in that space. Same school, again, just showing the types of interesting learning zones that these children are exposed to right from sort of first year of primary school. Why this is important, is back to the theme that we heard earlier on. These are the children that are going from primary school into secondary school into university. Will they sit still at university for a 400-person lecture? Probably not. So actually we need to evolve a set of learning experiences that support their learning styles in a very different way. Again, just showing different learning zones and activities, very non-traditional classroom spaces. This is one of my favorite learning spaces. This is a kindergarten in New Zealand, where I'm from originally, in Fiordland, and it's called a forest school. where they send the children out into the forest for 2 days of every week. So they spend 2 days outside, whether it's raining or whatever. And because it's New Zealand, they actually give the 4-year-olds axes and saws to play with, which I think is fairly brave. But what I think the important lesson from this is about taking learning outside, blurring the boundaries between inside learning and outside learning. And again, there's opportunities in libraries to create relaxation spaces, reading spaces, study spaces that are outside as well as inside. This is an interesting example. This is the Harkness table at the Phillips Academy in the States, which again is old-fashioned innovation. This table was first developed in 1944. It's called a Harkness table. And what this does is completely transform the classroom experience within a private school system. And this is used primarily in liberal arts private schools. But rather than having desks in a classroom, you have everyone round a round table. So that, again, the role of the teacher becomes facilitator, and this is using the Socratic method of dialogue amongst the class. There is nowhere to hide in this classroom. This is about creating a space to celebrate sharing of ideas. So this is an interesting one where the setting almost defines the pedagogy. And this is a similar one. This is an example that we came across in Pakistan. And this is what I really like because it's about cross-cultural borrowing. This is a postgraduate educational institute, so training postgraduate teachers. And this space is called a Kiva, K-I-V-A. And what they did in Karachi was borrow a Pueblo Indian sacred space from the southwest states of America and reinterpret it as a learning space. So this is a space for storytelling. So there's no technology allowed in the inner circle, and it's a space for these teacher trainers to come together and explore ideas. Again, a very democratic space where there is no hierarchy. The teacher is at the same level as the students, so they're learning together. So I think it's a very nice example of sort of blurred pedagogy in space. And this is another one of my favorite learning spaces. This is an old 400-seat lecture theatre, traditional tiered lecture theatre at the University of Melbourne. And they found that they didn't need lecture theatres anymore. Their pedagogy had moved away from lectures entirely. So they recreated it as a learning studio. So what I like about this is there is no front to this classroom. This is a space that has 7 or 8 different learning zones. The teacher comes in as facilitator, and then the students work together in groups. So it's reimagining an old, traditional, very rigid space into a much more flexible set of learning zones. And this is where we are today in terms of the sort of becoming the typical classroom model for higher education, which is learning studios. So again, moving from the traditional classroom space to a much more active pedagogy where there's group working as a significant part of the class. In this case, you'll see that each group has a large screen, so people using laptops at each table can flick their images up onto the large screen, and then those images can be shared across the whole classroom. So you don't all need to have the same sort of clear line of sight that's traditional classroom would, but it's about groups of people working together. This is a particularly nice example, is natural light and a high quality of environment. A lot of the American examples that you'll see of learning studios still think that because you're using computers, you don't need to look out of a window, which I would dispute very strongly. This space is an interesting one because, again, it breaks down another set of boundaries. This is Technical University of Delft Architecture Department, and they went through a very rapid change process because they burnt their building down completely. In 1960s, academic building was burnt to the ground, and they only had 8 months for the new academic year to reinvent themselves. For the first 6 months, or the first 8 months, they occupied a circus tent, which they absolutely liked until winter arrived, and then they went off it a bit. But they were given the oldest building in the university to say, you can have that, but it's 50% smaller than the space that you used to have. So they glassed in the courtyard between the building and created this learning zone. What was important about this space was that they got rid of the separation between students and academic staff. No staff have desks, they don't have offices, they share the same space as the students. This is one learning community, which wasn't particularly popular with some of the staff at the beginning, but it did mean that over time they did become co-learners rather than academics and students, which for architecture worked very well. Come on, here we go. This is the same space but from the side, so you can see that large lecture space actually has another lecture space within it. And at the top windows that you can see there is the Architecture Research Foundation, which is called the Institute of Why. And that's where they work together in project teams to explore issues. But the great thing is you don't know who's staff and who's a student. It's one learning community. Different type of space, but also based around problem solving. This is D-School, Design School at Stanford, which is an interdisciplinary space, which is an old laboratory that was redundant. But what they've done is create an interdisciplinary course, 1-year master's course, where people from across the whole university can come together to try to solve real-world problems. What I love about it is it's a space that's remade every year. The students build their own space. They put partitions up, they create group spaces. So it's what we call an appropriated space. And at the end of the academic year, they just clear it out and it becomes a white box again. So it's space that these people own and they live in for a year. And I think that's really nice that they can take ownership of that space. More recently, this space here, this is the Institute of Making at UCL, University College London, where this notion of the makerspace, which has been mentioned several times within libraries, here the purpose of the makerspace is to bring people in from different disciplines to share ideas. So it's become a core space where people from across the university meet with industry, meet with problem solvers. So more and more these sorts of spaces are becoming very valued and very important. So it's just a sort of range of spaces. I think you could see where pretty much all of those spaces could be reimagined within a library context, that these are settings that would work just as well within libraries. But a key thing is when we're thinking about learning space, it is this blend of digital and physical spaces we need to think about. We need to be able to accommodate face-to-face learning. That's easy. We've been doing that for decades and decades, hundreds of years. But equally, we need to bring the digital world into the classroom in a face-to-face way. And technology needs to cease to be artifacts. We're still at a time when we think of computers as just boxes on desks. Let's think about creating integrated environments where technology is supported by the space within which it's occupied. How do we bring in video? How do we connect different spaces using digital technology so that you can create blended learning spaces? But equally, you need to think about asynchronous digital space as part of the overall learning environment. What we call collaborative asynchronous space could be things like the discussion forums that we saw in the library earlier. How do you get people to engage and communicate and share ideas and have a record of that through the virtual learning environments? How do we use social networking? And then also, increasingly through blended learning, the use of self-paced asynchronous space or learning activities is important, where people take themselves through the basic gathering of information, of facts or whatever, and perhaps do multi-choice tests, study by themselves. Well, what spaces support that? If you can't work at home, what spaces do we at the university or the library need to provide to support self-directed learning as well as all these other areas? So what we're talking about there is a shift from physical environments to hybrid environments. So let's stop thinking about these two separate worlds of the physical and the digital and think about what it means to be in this really interesting bit in the middle. So how do we equip and form physical environments through technological features? And it's really important to remember that these spaces are complementary. They're not exclusive. So even when we're in a digital world, a virtual space, we're still sitting on a seat, we're still standing in a room. So how do these spaces support those activities you want to do? Some of the interesting activities we're looking at is what do we mean by visualization? How do we get people to access large data sets in innovative ways? This is Cave 2 from Monash, Steve, you might recognize it, which is about sort of a 280-degree immersive data environment where you can bring a class inside the space and experience varied data sets simultaneously, or just get inside a very large data set. What I find exciting about this is just as useful for humanities and social science subjects as it is for science. So you could bring in an archaeological 3D visualization, you could look at natural history, you could do all sorts of things with these spaces. But again, there's no point creating one of these spaces, which is several $1 million, if your pedagogy and your curriculum don't tie in with this. It needs integrated innovation to get any value out of these sorts of investments. They do look really good on the university websites, though. So from a marketing point of view and a commercial partnership point of view, they can be very attractive. But the last thing you want to do is put in a very expensive white elephant that needs to be maintained over time. This is another version. This is just a flat screen visualization space, but the quality of the screen is so high that it's effectively acting as a microscope. So again, you can start to bring your class into the space, into the data, and use it as a very active learning environment. This is the most recent one in the UK, and it's the KPMG World Data Laboratory at Imperial College, where again it's about creating a data space where business and academia can come together to explore ideas. These are really interesting spaces, and it's one of the challenges that universities have is, well, where do you put them? If you put one of these visualization spaces in computer science or engineering, it starts to be perceived as being owned by that faculty. What we're seeing a trend for is these sorts of expensive spaces that need to be shared. The library is the obvious place for these spaces to be located because that's neutral territory. There is an understanding that a library belongs to everyone. And so we're seeing broadcast studios, visualization spaces, information-rich learning environments being placed as a central resource within libraries. And I think that's really interesting as part of the enhanced library role that we've all been talking about for the last day or so. If only we could get slide clickers to behave. This is just an example to show that this isn't just for the heavy sciences, for maths. This is a humanities project in Vancouver where it was about linking performance with digital space. So this was a sort of digitally enhanced dance performance. So again, how do you create performance spaces, event spaces, using this technology that really bring the community together in different ways? This is another space at Stanford. This is Wallenberg Hall, which is a data laboratory. So again, this is a shared space where anyone can come in and access data. In this case, it's a journalism class doing simulations based on the last American presidential election. But the next day, it could be a teacher's ed class or a visualization. It's a blank digital space which can be reinvented on a day-to-day basis for different learning activities. Whenever I'm working with universities, there's quite often the statement, well, we still need lectures. We still need to deliver to large classes. And that's true. But what we are seeing is that lectures are being used in different ways. There's still a great role for lectures in university as theatre. Bringing in the guest speaker, the important person who inspires, the one lecture a year that can change your life. And so absolutely need to embrace that and create spaces to support it. But actually for day-to-day teaching, it's pretty rubbish as a way of conveying information. The retention rate is not great. So there's a lot of effort being placed to say, well, if we do have to have lecture spaces, how can we make them more active? How can we make them more collaborative? Part of that could be done by technology. We talked a lot about disruptive technologies before. I'd add another one to that, is the clicker voting button industry, which about 3 or 4 years ago, even maybe slightly longer, the notion that if you gave everyone a button like this at a lecture, you could ask them questions and they could give you answers, and then you could get real feedback. Now everyone just does it on their smartphone, and so you get this dialogue between academic and students around issues. Although interestingly enough, I still get asked by academics for, if we have a lecture theatre, could we have it lead-lined so that there is no mobile signals in my space? Because people keep using their devices while I'm talking, and that's disturbing me. It's like, I think you've lost that battle. So the notion of using technology to create some degree of interactivity, I think, has still got potential. There's this sort of space, what's known as a Harvard classroom, where it's about smaller, more intimate groups, about creating spaces where the lecturer can come out into the class. Typically, you identify each student by name, so it becomes a conversation, a dialogue, and you need to prepare before the classes. So this is very common in business schools. I don't know how common they are here, but to us, this is a very good space. It's got its downsides. It's very expensive. In terms of square meters per student, a typical classroom where you have tablets and chairs, that's about 1.5 square meters per student. If you start to put desks in so you can use laptops, it's about 1.8 square meters per student. You start to go towards active learning studios, that's 2.7 to 3.2, and Harvard's are about 2.9 to 3. So you, as a university owner, if you move from passive learning to active learning, you've got to use space very carefully because it's expensive. For a typical English university, to go from passive learning to active learning could be 20,000 square meters, 30,000 square meters more teaching space. The way that we can't afford that, so what we have to do is look at utilization of learning spaces to pay for this. I would be very interested to know what the utilization of teaching spaces is in Thailand. In the UK, the general classrooms, the typical utilization rate is about 35%, 28 to 35%. So any time 60% of our classrooms across the country are empty, or there are empty seats in those classrooms. So to pay for getting these bigger spaces, we have to move the utilization from 30% to 60%. And then we can have half as many spaces that are twice as big without actually adding to the real estate at all. So it means that the people planning the curriculum and the estates people have to work together to create, to economically create these sorts of spaces. This is another example of innovation in lecture theatres. This is becoming the standard sort of active learning lecture theatre in the UK. Very expensive, again, from a space point of view, but what they've tried to do is combine group working and lectures in one space. So I call it like a jazz bar lecture theatre. It's sort of combining nightclub and lecture theatre, in that you have groups of people working around a small table. So typically groups of 5, and you can go from lecture to small group. I don't like this space because the tables are useless. They look like tables. They're too low, too far away, and there's a slope on it. So you've got about a 50% chance of your laptop going straight over the edge. But it's a classic case where the design has started. This is Gen 1. I think the next one will be more interesting. And this is a different version at Sheffield University, where they had a redundant lecture theatres again. So there they just took a different strategy and created these sort of tiered group tables. What's nice about this is that this can be used out of lecture time as a group study space. So it's a different attempt at innovation within the lecture context. This is a blended learning classroom I did in Karachi, which was using an existing really poorly designed space. So the acoustics were dreadful, which is why we have those acoustic cubes hanging down. But there the goal was to create a learning studio that could connect Kabul, Karachi and Nairobi for medical education. So through video conferencing, we could connect between these spaces and create simultaneous learning experiences. To watch that happening was really amazing. To go back to libraries a bit, because a core theme obviously of today, this was a diagram I found recently, which initially is quite terrifying. This was a study of across all American research libraries, looking at library use between 1995 and 2015. And what they found was that between 2009 and 2015, circulations in American research libraries fell by almost half. So the number of books actually taken out reduced from 36 million to 19 million. And the number of books per person taken out dropped from 25 to 7. So a 72% decrease in the use of books by taking out of books. What was interesting is, well, that initially you think libraries are dead, we're extinct, as was mentioned earlier on. But actually, this reflects the change and the shift towards digital technology, digital resources rather than physical. So again, it suggests a completely different type of space, different type of use of the library. This is an early example in the UK of that transition from traditional library to social learning space. This is the Saltire Centre at Glasgow Caledonian Library. So when they refurbished their library, they moved the study spaces, the quiet spaces, up to the top floors of the building and made the ground floor a learning marketplace. So it's always noisy, always crowded. It's the place you hang out. And there's lots of different learning settings there that the students can move around and reconfigure. Really successful space. If you're going back to visit the space a few years on, though, it showed me a really important lesson about these sorts of innovative learning spaces, was that it's no good designing a space like this and then just walking away. It has to be curated. It has to be managed. What we found is when we went back, some of the furniture had moved and was being used in a different way, was broken, or the power sockets didn't reach the cables anymore. And so probably if you went there every day, you wouldn't notice the difference. But going back after a period of time, it was no longer as effective. So what I would say was that you need to think about the ongoing management of innovative learning spaces in the library or elsewhere right from day one. Another really nice library space, this is the Rankin Brown Library in New Zealand, Victoria University in New Zealand, in Wellington. What I like about this is, to go back to one of my favourite subjects, corridors. This is taking a little sliver of space within a circulation route and turning it into a series of learning zones. So you can see here there's a group study space with glass boards for people to write on, and then there's study booths next to it. So it's creating what we call a learning corridor. And there's many, many opportunities to do that if you plan it right from the start. Just to look at some contemporary libraries that are perhaps not quite as contemporary as they should be. This is the Biblioteca Alexandria, which has opened fairly recently. Huge new library. I think it's 4.5 million books it's built for. They've worked out, they have 500,000 books now. The French government felt sorry for them and gave them another 500,000 books. But they've worked out it's going to take 80 years to fill their bookcases. But what I like about this library is that the sort of study terraces are interesting, but also this library is one of the 3 mirror sites for the internet. So it's got one of the largest stores of the internet within the space, which symbolically, given it's the Alexandria Library, is, I think, really interesting, that this is a blend of the physical artifact and the digital, and arguably they have more digital than physical. Library that's opening this month in Qatar. Again, another huge learning zone, 2 million books. But what's also interesting here is, it is, again, before the library opened, the virtual library opened, this is a digital exhibition area within the space. So even though at one level they're a very conventional, traditional library, the blurring of the digital and the physical has been central right from the start. One of the areas where I'm doing a lot of work is around breaking out of the boundary, the physical space boundary of the institution, to think about learning wherever it takes place. This diagram here is about network learning, which came from some colleagues that I used to work with in the States, just starting to think about, well, we have the learning hubs, we have multi-use spaces that could be shared by other people. What are the city spaces that also become part of the learning landscape? Why do we constrain ourselves to within an institution when actually it's more and more about partnering and working between institutions? So what is the learning city? What is the learning campus? All of these are really interesting. And I'll come back to some examples of what we call the blended innovation landscape, where it's a mixture of physical and virtual, owned and shared and occupied. So this is a model we came up for taking that learning landscape forward to say that there are learning settings, there are elements, right down to the level of the chair, the light, the table. These can be combined to create different settings, some of which are physical, some of which are virtual. These settings can be combined into what we call a learning arena. So a classroom could be a corridor, a laboratory, and they could be positioned in a whole range of different places. A school, a college, a library, a museum, an art gallery, a shopping mall, as TK Parker's. All of these are interesting combinations that are worth exploring. And where I think there's a hugely exciting opportunity is again about the blurring of the boundaries between these spaces. What are the spaces that we could create that bring schools and colleges and higher education together with the workplace? So in the UK, we're finding joint use libraries being created between schools, potentially in colleges. We're seeing shared opportunities for schools studying in art galleries and museums, creating performance spaces linked to workspaces. So there are these sort of new partnerships that could happen that could reinvent libraries in very exciting different ways. And so the last sort of section I'll show is some sort of blended examples where this is already happening. This is UCL Academy. So in the UK government put a very strong message out a few years ago that they wanted universities to get more involved in schools, to actually sponsor them. So we had a sort of system of academies where before you could become an academy, you needed a sponsor. Initially, universities did this because they had to, and they treated it a bit like missionary outreach work, that you would sponsor a school and then you'd send some lecturers out once a year to talk to them. What UCL did was integrate the school and the university much more closely so that the senior children at the school use the laboratories at the university. They do their induction at the university. Lecturers come and give events here. So it becomes a seamless learning experience from school through to university. And so this helps retention rates or helps transfer rates into university and creates a single learning community. Again, the university students can act as mentors to the school students, so it's very much a win-win across the two institutions. I feel like a rat in a Skinner box. I'm a psychologist by background. You keep pressing the bar until something happens. Here we go. I couldn't resist putting this slide in because I've been using it for years as an example of a blended learning space. You know, the idea of creating a learning space, a library above a shopping centre, was absolutely perfect for me. And so I have been using it. So I felt I needed to put, in homage to TK Park, I needed to include the slide because it's still just as exciting. We went there the other day and I just found it really inspirational. So there'll be a new slide in my presentation next year because I took lots of photographs. Oops, sorry. To go back, here we go. This is an interesting slide. This is a slide of the business school at Hamburger University, which is McDonald's University in Beijing. And what I put this slide in is we're seeing new providers of higher education. So these are currently offering up to master's degrees and are heading towards a PhD program. And what they say is that actually the McDonald's University is more exclusive than Harvard. Harvard has a 6% acceptance rate for new students, whereas to get into the Hamburger University, it's got a 1% acceptance rate. And so it's actually becoming a prestigious business school within the commercial environment. I think you have to then work in a hamburger shop, but say you've still got a good business degree. This is a really interesting blended space. This is, it's called Here East, H-E-R-E. For the last Olympics in the UK, this was the media centre where all the broadcast activities happened. After the Olympics was over, they didn't need that, so they stripped it out. It's a very big building. You could put 7 747s next to each other inside this building. It was just a big shed. Well, what's interesting about it is the developer who bought it has reclad it and turned it into a learning community. So Loughborough University has 2,000 automotive engineers based in this building. It's nowhere near the rest of their university. UCL has its architecture and some engineering in it. British Telecom has a television station based there. There's a members club, a hotel. There's a whole range of leisure activities. So suddenly this becomes a warehouse for learning. And it's an incredibly interesting model because, again, it's blurring that boundary between leisure, learning, working. It's all happening in the same space. Just some more pictures of that. And this is another space we worked in. It's called the Backstage Centre at a place called Purfleet in London, where we had a very interesting client group, which was partly the Royal Opera House and partly the sort of rock and roll federation. So the head of a sort of 80s rock group was our other client. This was to create a training centre for backstage skills, so everything to do with theatre and performance. So lighting, sound, all of those, makeup, costumes, and created this huge space. What's interesting is it's become a commercial space as well. So this is where all the stadium bands rehearse. And so the learning institution now earns more money from stadium bands rehearsing than they do from their courses. But it's a blended learning space where formal education happens at the same time as professional and vocational. That's just showing it in full space. The main learning space here was a 20 metre by 20 metre by 20 metre cube, so you could do all your lighted grids, but it's an incredibly interesting space. A new entrant into the learning world in London is a place called Tile Yard. Again, it's about this blurring of boundaries, because this was a redundant office park from the 1980s near King's Cross in central London. Very bad area at the time, and these buildings had never been occupied. And a couple of old musicians who were too old, they felt, to go on the road anymore with their bands, persuaded an investor to put 30 or 40 million pounds into this building, or set of buildings, to build 70 recording studios, world-class recording studios, and a range of other support spaces. And that's really interesting. So initially they got established performers to come and record there and study there and write there. But now people like Liam Gallagher and Lily Cole are all based here. And all the major record companies have moved out of the record area into this building. But why it's interesting, why I'm talking about it, is it now offers master's degrees in music entrepreneurship and a whole range of other, in partnership with the university, so it's become an education provider. But the reason it's really important is once a month on a Thursday night, if you go there, 1,500 musicians from around London descend on the space. So it becomes a community space, a performance space, a networking space. Some of these people may take on studios here, but they'll certainly learn, they'll meet producers, becomes an active learning community. So this, to me, will attract a whole different student demographic than a traditional learning experience. So I'm finding these sorts of spaces incredibly interesting. This is one of my research interests, which is academic retirement communities. That there are more than 70 universities in the States that have retirement communities on campus. So that when you retire, you move back to university and you continue learning in your third age. And also give back to the university through mentoring students, through leaving legacies to there. And these spaces can transition from independent living right the way through to assisted living. So they connect into the medical programs of the university, but it's about creating another layer of the learning community within the space, which I think is very interesting. And lastly, just some school-based ones. This is a museum linked to education. This is the New York Museum School, where 4 different museums come together to create a single charter school where students use the landscape of museums as their classroom. What could be better as a child than to spend your classroom days learning mathematics in the Natural History Museum, connecting with the collection and the experts? Similarly, in one of my sort of quintessential learning spaces is the Museum of Natural History in London. I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's a spectacular Victorian institution. But why I like it is that it's a layered learning space, that there are learning programs for 5-year-olds at the space, but equally there's school programs, there's undergraduate programs. There are 2 master's courses based here in taxonomy, and then there are 250 PhD students, all based in this space. So some people use it as entertainment space, some use it for schools, some use it for universities, all at the same time. So it's a set of parallel learning worlds within the same space. And I think lastly, this is the Eden project in Cornwall, a big nature space, conservation space. The building at the front is the education space. So again, more and more we're blurring leisure and learning, formal learning and informal learning. All of these are happening in much richer range of spaces than the traditional educational landscape. Institutions in London, it's interesting that this blurring is becoming almost a fetish, that it's becoming compulsory, that there are 3 new university campuses being built in London at the moment, and all 3 of them are following a similar innovation model. The notion of creating a university that's bounded is becoming less and less relevant. Each of them has created an innovation community that mixes academic activities with commercial activities, with leisure and social activities. So this is White City, Imperial College. They're building 400,000 square meters of space here. Every 2 years there'll be 1 academic building, 1 commercial building built. That's going to be a population of about 20,000 people learning and living and working. Similarly, King's College, and I've forgotten which one that one is, but they're all following a very similar. I approve at one level because I like the integration. I'm not sure that they look like, they don't feel to me like universities anymore. There's something of the spirit has gone. So I'm really interested to see how these will evolve, and it'll be through events and through use rather than through architecture. I think the point that overall, though, that I've stressed throughout this presentation is that we need to think about balanced innovation. There's absolutely no point creating innovative learning spaces unless we think about these other things in parallel. We think about the pedagogy, how we want to use those spaces, how do we want to deliver learning or teaching and research, what is the curriculum, what are the subjects we're trying to support, and how does technology create opportunities for learning and doing that in new ways. So it's all of those things in parallel. So my big summary, I suppose, is when I think about great spaces to learn, it's space, place, process, and experience. If I was going to get a T-shirt printed, those are the words that I would print on it. Because space is about creating efficient space that actually delivers what you want to do in an effective way that is the right size, has the right infrastructure. But place is important. Place is very different to space. Place is about creating well-designed, meaningful spaces that inspire, that make you want to learn, that make you want to explore ideas, that encourage curiosity. Process, incredibly important. What do you want to do in those spaces? How is it supported? So blending, learning, working, leisure. And then what's the experience? What's the experience getting to that learning space, being there, staying there, leaving? All of these things need to be thought about. And if you do all of those things, if you have those in your mind when you're designing a new library or a new learning space, I think you've got a much better chance of success. And I think why I got so excited about being at this conference is, we talked about loving libraries. We all love libraries. And I think libraries are in a unique place. They have a unique opportunity across the whole spectrum of libraries, from school libraries to public libraries to academic libraries, to reinvent, to add, to enhance, to reimagine what you do and how you deliver it. So we're seeing add-ons like turning school libraries into community learning centres to bring in wider stakeholders into the library, technology access spaces, maker spaces, event spaces. All of these can add to the richness of the library experience that you're creating or providing. So I think it's a brave new world, brave new future in terms of libraries as active, as great learning spaces. But what I would just like to finish on is, I've talked about a lot of this already, the future learning experience. It's about creating flexible, adaptable, robust spaces that can change over different cycles of time, even the day, the week, the year, and blending the physical and the digital. But I'll finish with two of my favorite learning spaces, which are not necessarily conventional learning spaces. This is a train carriage. Why I use this as an example of great learning spaces, this is a group of students at Aalto University in Helsinki. It was their entrepreneurship society. And these students decided that they wanted to go to Shanghai for the exhibition when that was on. And so they thought, let's use this as an opportunity. So the Entrepreneurship Society, being entrepreneurs, went out to Helsinki and raised money. They raised 250,000 euros from Helsinki businesses. And then they went to the Moscow State Train Company and hired a train and got the train as close to Finland as you could. And then they, as a group, chose the academics that they liked, that they thought would be useful, and created an academic program and invited these academics to join the train. And then they set off, I think, 150 students on this train that had a dining car, a classroom, a gymnasium, restaurant, sleeping cars. And they set off through Mongolia to get to Shanghai. And they spent a 10-day learning experience that they determined as students. They created, explored, but they also got contracts from Nokia to develop and test apps on the train as a user group. So it became group learning activities. It became life-changing for these students. So I think if we can create spaces and opportunities for learning that allows this level of self-determination, of passion, of curiosity, I think we've succeeded as providers of education spaces. Interestingly enough, it worked so well. The next year they hired a cruise ship to go to Brazil to look at the Latin American emerging economies. So it took a whole bunch of economists to Latin America on the boat. Absolutely, I think, an inspirational experience for them. And then the last space is a Chinese learning space called the Bridge School, which I think symbolically represents exactly where we want this conference to be. This was two villages in a very remote part of China, which had hated each other for 400 years. These two villages on each side of this river had been arguing and disputing, having disputes for 400 years because there was no direct link between the two villages. The river often made it unpassable. So this young architect decided to build a school to link the two villages. So he created the Bridge School and suspended a pedestrian bridge underneath the school, which was the first direct connection between these two villages for 400 years. And then just hung the school above the gorge. But what's nice was that at the heart of the two classrooms was the library. So the library became literally the space joining these two villages together as an information space. And then each of the ends could open up as a performance space. Just show a couple of images of that. So symbolically, I thought, great. So here you see the pedestrian bridge linking the two villages, the classrooms with the library in the middle. It's actually completely transformed the village in all sorts of different ways. And apart from improving communication, they now have architects from around the world coming in pilgrimage to look at the buildings. So suddenly the whole economy of the village has picked up through the library and through these spaces as being an attraction in their own right. Oops, sorry. That's the classrooms at the edge of the building. That's one of the traditional village houses which was on each side. So to me, that's a very inspirational, small-scale intervention that shows how learning spaces and libraries can make a huge difference to a community. So I thank you very much. I'd like to leave it there. More of my ideas are in this book that came out a couple of years ago, but I've learnt so much from everyone else here today that I hope you found this useful as well. So thank you very much.
ขอบคุณค่ะ Thank you very much คุณ Andrew.
Thank you.
So I guess anyone has any questions? มีคำถามไหมคะยกมือได้เลยนะคะเรามีเจ้าหน้าที่นำไมค์ไปให้ค่ะมีไหมคะถ้ามองจากมุมบนเวทีของหนูนะคะถ้าขึ้นมายืนตรงนี้นะคะจะเห็นพี่ๆถอดหูฟังพร้อมกันปุ๊บออกมานะคะเดี๋ยวมีชาวต่างชาติอีกหนึ่งท่านค่ะเป็นสปีกเกอร์ท่านสุดท้ายนะคะอย่าเพิ่งถอดนะคะเดี๋ยวเราฟังกันต่ออีก1เซสชันสุดท้ายมีไหมคะมีท่านใดมีคำถามไหมคะไม่เป็นไรค่ะถ้าเกิดว่ามีคำถามก็ติดต่อคุณแอนดรูได้นะคะ Thank you very much a big round of applause once again ขอบคุณค่ะนี่ก็คือคุณแอนดรูแฮริสันนะคะก็มาเล่ากรณีศึกษานะคะเป็น case study แล้วก็ตัวอย่างที่เรียกว่าเป็นแบบอย่างที่ดีแล้วก็เชื่อว่าสามารถนำมาปรับใช้ในเมืองไทยของเราได้ด้วยนะคะสำหรับกรณีพื้นที่ในการเรียนรู้ต่างๆเนี่ยนะคะน่าสนใจมากๆเลยนะคะตอนนี้นะคะเดี๋ยวบนจอค่ะตอนนี้ขึ้นเป็นอะไรเอ่ยเป็นเว็บไซต์ใช่ไหมคะขึ้นมาแล้วนี่เลยค่ะบนจอนะคะนี่คือภาพของคุณตุลค่ะเป็นภาพที่เราสรุปหัวข้อการบรรยายของคุณแอนดรูทั้งหมดเลยนะคะถ้าไหนสนใจก็ถ่ายภาพจากบนจอได้เลยค่ะ